Depending upon the time of the year, the weather, the climate, you had an individual who might be waked for a day or two at the most, summertime, 80, 90, 100 degrees temperature, because nature is going to decompose an individual very quickly. It's just as the food spoiled. In the wintertime, they could leave a window open in the room with no heat in it, and the individual perhaps could be awake for 2-3 days. Now, at a little later period, they began to think about preserving the body. And their first thought, always following the lines of food, was the use of ice. So we had the situation where the person who was acting as an undertaker would furnish a container for the individual, a large tub or an open coffin, so to speak, which was metal-lined, waterproof, and the body would be put in there, and then ice would be put on the body in direct contact. Later on, they invented what were called corpse-preserving containers. These were like a large box with trays for the ice. It was totally enclosed and airtight, and there was a large opening that was glass so that the family could look in or friends could look in and view the body.
Americans became familiar with the age-old art of embalming during the Civil War. Suddenly, the remains of hundreds of soldiers needed to be preserved for shipment to hometowns all across the North and South.
These militia companies all came from the same community early on in the war. They all came from this little town, Bodhieville, let's call it. Now, everybody that was in that company came from Bodhieville. So when poor Tom died, they all said, gee, we got to send him home. So they'd all chip in $1 or 50 cents or whatever it took, and they'd go to a number of embalmers who came to Washington. They came to Washington because that's where the troops were. That's where they were dying. So they would go to one of these men and say, Tom died and he's at so-and-so a regimental hospital. And he'd say, well, where do you want to send him? To Bodhieville, Minnesota. Okay. So he'd say, let's see. We'd go over to the express company and find out what the costs of transportation were. Remember, the government didn't pay for any of this. So he'd say, and our charges are for a coffin and for the embalming, because they have to preserve the body long enough for the 4, 5, 6 day or a week trip. When it got home, they'd take it out to the house. They'd be down there with one of the farm wagons, or if it's in the city, they'd deliver it with an express wagon to the house. And they'd open the coffin and look at him. Boy, he does look nice. And so on. And this was one of the very few times that they knew about it. That's that newfangled thing they call embalming. Gradually in the newspapers, you began to see ads. By the end of the war, there was not any medium-sized place, as well as many small communities, who were not unfamiliar with the term embalming and what it implied. Lincoln was viewed by millions of people because at his death, he was embalmed in the White House. You had the body viewed, open coffin. They had a service for him. He was then taken to a number of different cities on his route, railroad route. And each city he was taken off the railroad car, open coffin, had services for him. Thousands of people viewed the body. And people were familiar with the open coffin, the preservation and so forth. They were ready for it. It wasn't something that the Egyptians did. It was something that the Americans did. You had then the ability of the undertaker to understand the advantages of this. No more ice. Ice sometimes was unavailable. He had the ability to fairly well control things. He liked the appearance better. It got rid of odors which inevitably crept in. And it was an advantage all the way around. And then the business of competition. If you could embalm and I couldn't, that might be a factor in people going to ask for your services.
Almost everybody in the world has a little bit of stubble, a little bit of stubble, even if they're a female. So I'm going to shave just a little bit so that when I put cosmetics on, even though I don't use a great deal of cosmetics, the stubble will not show through, which is it
The
does.
whole embalming process takes an hour to an hour and a half and about 3 gallons of
Be
fluid.
very careful to
Normally,
do
the
this very
remains are
lightly
fully
on a lady.
exposed. The plastic sheet is for the benefit of the camera.
A woman's skin is more delicate than a man's skin. This is called a needle injector. This injects a small pin into the upper jaw and the lower jaw, leaving these wires exposed. These wires will be drawn together and will actually hold her jaw shut, so that once the embalming is complete, her mouth is closed and in a restful position. The next thing I'm going to be doing is inserting something called an eye cap. This is a plastic film with ridges cut out of it, which will be placed between the eyeball and the eyelid. Very often you see on television someone just magically moves their hands across the eyes and they're closed and that's all there is to it. Unfortunately, it isn't quite that simple. People pass away with their eyes open, and we try to have them be perfectly closed so that when they're viewed in the casket, somebody doesn't see them with their eyes half open and wonder what's the matter with that.
The actual embalming starts with a mixture of specially manufactured perfumes, dyes, disinfectants, and preservatives that vary from case to case.
There are other fluids that you would use, for example, if someone drowned, that would cause the tissues to release more fluid. Whereas in this case, the fluids that we use cause the tissues to actually gather more fluid and retain that so that she will eventually have a very much more natural appearance because the tissue actually has more fluid in it than when we started.
The embalming fluid can be injected into any of 6 pressure points. The ideal situation is a 1-point injection through a small incision at the base of the neck into the right carotid artery. The fluid travels through the circulatory system while the blood drains via the jugular vein. A reverse injection is done into the head to complete the process.
Now, one of the things that we've noticed at this point is that the veins in the back of the hands have begun to raise as if there was fluid in them, and that's because there's fluid in them. And that means that the blood and bodily fluids are moving through them, and the embalming fluid is going to be moving into the hands very quickly. And so we want to massage the hands a little bit and move the arms a little bit.
Anytime I've seen anybody do this, I can't help but be touched by the way funeral directors handle the remains.
Well, I believe the reason for that is this is a person. This is to be treated like a person and not like something other than a person. Otherwise, there's no purpose in doing all of this. This isn't done for any ghoulish purpose. This is done for the intention of eventually having the family be comforted by it. At this point, we're a day later from the day that we did the embalming, and we are going to clothe the remains, and we're going to, at this point, I'm going to be filling out the features.
The fullness of the face is restored by skillfully injecting and manipulating a substance called tissue filler under the skin. The funeral director works on the whole face but concentrates on the right half, since that, for some long-forgotten reason, is the traditional viewing side.
This is truly a word-of-mouth type subject. You can't say to the public, well, we make people look better than the next guy or better than our competitor, because it doesn't sound like something that somebody wants to choose you for.
If a dress does not button down or have a zipper, usually we'll need to put a small slit in the back, and that's just basically to accommodate getting the clothing over the hips and the lower abdomen. Something that you don't really think about is that shoes pose a problem for us. The embalming process stiffens and puts the body, the foot in a particular position which may not be the same as the shoe.
The remains are casketed and then displayed under a rose-tinted light to help bring out the flesh tones.
This is the area where I closed the incision from the embalming process. And what I'm going to do is just very carefully and very superficially coat that area with restoration wax. And then after the cosmetics have been placed, that incision is merely going to disappear, hopefully.
Makeup, designed not to depend on body heat to soften it, is applied. And then the hair is often done by a local hairdresser. Betty Renninger has been administering the last hairdo for over 50 years.
I usually set them. Curling iron doesn't hold up so well, although it doesn't have to last that